Hey guys, welcome to another edition of BAH 10. I'm going to ask you guys to maybe help me come up with a theme song that I can use for my episodes here. Okay, so last class we talked about the Latin American independence movements, and you guys did a nice job with with the way you connected the puzzle pieces to some of the issues in Latin America today. All of the things we're going to be learning coming up is inevitably leading us to World War One. So it's appropriate here that the ending date for this section is 1914, which is the first year of the First World War. Okay, so so we talked about the independence, but what about the things that happened after the independence of Latin American nations? It wasn't just them getting their independence that led to some of the issues we see today, but the things that happened after. Now, I borrowed this slide from someone, so it doesn't have the five current issues, but if I can refresh my memory, I believe they were poverty, child labor and labor, political corruption, influence of the United States, and violence, I believe. Okay, so let's talk about how some of these things have impacted those current issues in Latin America. All right, so right after the independence movement of many of these Latin American countries, you had a large group of poor Latin Americans. Most of them were poor farmers. So this led to, of course, political problems, specifically military dictators taking over some South American countries, and they called those caudillos. And the poor people had no power; only property owners can vote, and reformers were quickly removed from office, just like dictators often do. They don't allow people who are looking to seek change to have much of a voice. So you had these strong dictators that took over in Latin America, and honestly, sometimes they were supported by the people because, just like we see in the 20th century, oftentimes dictators promise a better life, and they occasionally trick the people into thinking that it's actually true. All right, so who were the major foreign powers that dealt with Latin America? Well, once Latin America, South and Central America was able to rid themselves of Spanish rule, that's when the United States, of course, and Great Britain stepped in and basically started what some call economic imperialism. Now, we learned a lot about imperialism earlier this year in Africa and in Asia. This is a little different. This was not America coming in or Britain coming in and completely taking over these countries. It was more like the imperialism we saw in Asia, which was having an economic influence on these countries. Okay, so one of the big issues was that Latin American economies depended on export, but they didn't make much. That was the problem. So to import goods, they needed to make money. They needed to import a lot, but it cost them more than they made from exports. So they were spending more money than they were getting in terms of trade. A huge event in Latin American history is the Monroe Doctrine. You'll learn a lot more about this next year. But the Monroe Doctrine basically was the United States saying, all right, keep out to Europe. The Latin Americans, South America, they're our neighbors, and we will protect them. So do not come into our territory. It was basically a warning to European empires to stay out of Latin America. Ooh, I got to go quicker. There's only 10 minutes. Well, one of the few remaining countries that was still under Spanish rule in Latin America and in the Caribbean was Cuba. And in the 1890s, Cuba fought for independence. They were led by Jose Marti, who was a writer and someone who fought for Cuban independence, very much an admirer of American democracy. But also, he was wary or nervous about American help during the Cuban independence movement because he correctly thought that the Americans would want something in return if they helped Cuba get its independence. It was terrible. The Spanish placed Cubans in concentration camps. And the United States, they used the concentration camps as kind of a reason for getting involved in this independence movement. But the probably closer to the truth is that Cuba had a lot of resources that the United States was interested in. So, despite Jose Marti being concerned, the Americans did get involved in Cuban independence, and this was called the Spanish-American War. In 1898, the United States was able to help Cuba pretty much easily defeat the Spanish. It helped the United States also gain a lot of new territories throughout the world. You could see, well, this was before the Spanish-American War, but the United States got Alaska, Hawaii, and then several Spanish-owned islands. Following the Spanish-American War, President Theodore Roosevelt, who many see as one of our better presidents, the United States' better president, came up with something called the Roosevelt Corollary. It's a good vocabulary word. A corollary is something, you probably hear it in math actually. It's something that's added on to something else. So this corollary was added on to the Monroe Doctrine, saying we will defend with force anyone who tries to get involved in Latin American affairs. A big part of this was the United States getting control of the Panama Canal. Prior to the 1900s, Panama was owned by Colombia. The United States decided to offer Colombia $10 million. Colombia said no. This is what the Panama Canal looked like. Colombia wanted more money, so what the United States did was they decided to support the Panamanians to get their independence from Colombia. But the catch was that in order to get their independence, Panama had to agree to give the United States the right to the land to build the Panama Canal. We already said this. All right, so what about Mexico? The United States was also involved in Mexico, not just Cuba and South America. And the Mexican dictator, after they got their independence from Spain, was a man named Santa Anna. He served as president 4 times. He was very beloved at first by the Mexicans, but he became kind of an abusive dictator, sort of like the ones in South America. So how did the U.S. get involved in Mexico? Well, Texas won its independence from Mexico in the 1830s, and in the 1840s, the United States, you might remember that this is the famous Remember the Alamo. Anyway, in the 1840s, the United States decided to annex Texas, which meant take control over Texas, and this was not very welcomed by our neighbors in Mexico, who did not think that the United States wasn't really showing friendly relations if the United States was just taking Texas. But many Americans lived in Texas. This was the problem. So what happens as a result of this? A border dispute called the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. The border, Santa Anna lost, and Mexico surrendered a lot of their land. Mexico used to be a lot bigger. It included, you can't really see me pointing, but it included Texas down here. It included present-day California, New Mexico, other states like that. And the United States gained this territory. That's how we continued to grow. Benito Juarez was the leader of La Reforma, which was a reform movement in Mexico, aimed at achieving land reform, better education. He was a very important figure in Mexican history. He tried to make things a little bit more fair, try to break up the large landowners of Mexico and give some land to the people. In 1858, he was able to win control of Mexico. Then in 1862, Napoleon's, I think it's his, I should check this, but I want to say it's is it his grandson or grandnephew? Anyway, Napoleon III captured Mexico in 18 months in 1862. Juarez and his followers took 5 years to finally remove the French from Mexico. In 1872, Juarez passed away, and a dictator unfortunately took control and was in power for 30 years. Porfirio Diaz, not someone who was liked by the United States. He restored order like dictators often do, but he limited political freedom like dictators often do. Francisco Madero was someone who believed in democracy. He was an enemy of Diaz. This is someone the United States liked. You could probably see where this is going. This is what we do. We get involved. Pancho Villa is a very famous figure in Mexican history. He was a leader of the Mexican Revolution, and then Emiliano Zapata was a leader of a powerful revolutionary army. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution started when Francisco Madero challenged Porfirio Diaz politically. Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata raised armies and forced Diaz to step down. Now, that we don't get into America's involvement that much here, but America was involved on the side of Porfirio Diaz. So when Pancho Villa and Zapata tried to bring him down, at first the United States was all for this, but once Pancho Villa and Zapata seemed like they were starting to form a dictatorship of their own, the United States was against this. The Mexican Revolution officially ended in 1920, but the fighting continued. And in 1929, the Institutional Revolutionary Party brings peace and stability to Mexico. I'm not giving you a test. So you can see some of the issues that happen. There's common themes, I think, here. Rising of dictatorships, very little control for the poor people. The rich controlled a lot of the land. Political instability, economic troubles. The United States being involved in a lot of these things in Latin America. So again, we're going to try to have you figure out how the issue, basically, I guess you could say the 19th century, the 1800s for Latin America after they gained their independence. How did the 1800s impact some of these issues that we see today in Latin America? How are these some of the puzzle pieces along with a few of the other puzzle pieces we learned about earlier? Okay, so I went a little bit over. I want to give a huge shout out to the B78 class who's watching all over Union County. We thank you guys for subscribing, and I hope you come see us again here on BAH 10.